In the 6th chapter of St. Luke, immediately after two episodes regarding the Sabbath, one that in which the Lord invokes the case of David, who goes into the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, in response to the way in which the Pharisees accuse the disciples of doing things which aren't allowed, in this case in the context of the Sabbath. And the second one, the case of the healing of a man precisely on the day of the Sabbath, a man who had a withered hand. I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it? Well, after this altercation between the Lord and the Pharisees, we have this unexpected move into silence. In these days, he went out into the hills to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. Here we have the public worship and we have the private encounter. If much of our public worship does not profit fully from the dynamic of worship, it is often because the private encounter is lacking. It is not enough to execute certain acts. There has to be encounter. There has to be friendship. There has to be relationship. And when that is there, and when that is the prime mover, the rest will follow. Let us look today at one important figure in the liturgical movement, Pius Parsch. He was operating in Austria, but he combined in his person several strands. He can be regarded as the leader of the liturgical movement in Austria, but he saw the centrality of our Christian Sabbath, the Sunday, as the place of encounter. But in that encounter, he pulled all the strands together: biblical, liturgical, spiritual. There is the impact that the First World War had on his soul. That has to be observed because it led him to see certain things and to work upon them evermore. We have this testimony from his own pen. I spent 4 years at the front as a chaplain. It was in the course of this work that I began to realize the importance of the Bible for both priests and layfolk. I realized too how important it was that people should learn to understand the liturgy and take an intelligent part in it. I returned home from the war full of these two discoveries and resolved to devote the rest of my life to propagating these ideals. So, Divine Providence gave him the use of an old chapel, St. Gertrude's. He began over 30 years of liturgical formation and celebration with ordinary people, earning himself the epitaph of apostle of active participation. one notable element in the celebration in that chapel was the way in which the divine office was exploited positively and made to dovetail into the liturgy of the Mass itself. We have this testimony. It is early Sunday morning. At 7:15, Father Parsch enters to prepare the altar for the sacrifice. Then, seated at the throne with a few ministers about, he leads the small group that are present in morning matins, in the German. After the Te Deum, the organ intones the opening sunrise praises of Lauds. By now, there are many more present, and this prayer is in large part sung. Already one realizes that there are no onlookers. All are participants. During the Benedictus, incensing is done around the entire altar. Following Lauds, the ministers retire to the sacristy. Then all stand when the main procession enters. So we have cross-bearer and candles, incense, and these little chierichetti in Italian, little clerics, they're altar boys, dressed fittingly. And remember now, this has been over the centuries the main source of recruitment with regard to vocations, and the Church knows it. The large church bells ring out, and the people sing with full voice, alternating with the chanters. The Kyrie is threefold. The first part sung by the young men chanters, the second Kyrie by the young women, and the third by all the faithful. The Gloria is sung in phrases, alternating between scholar and community. And then the way in which the people are allowed to understand the prayers, otherwise in Latin, is described by the way in which provision is made for a lector to read them in German. The actual liturgical execution is that of the priest, but there is an awareness that people need to understand. So this is the solution that he comes up with. And that can be seen throughout the celebration. However, the canon is maintained, and there's a beautiful description of the way in which it leads to interiority, and he does not abandon that principle. The canon in silence suggests mystery. There is, throughout his celebrations, this element of involvement on every level with the people who are not in any way spectators. He actually maintains and praises the ancient last gospel. It is actually a lovely conclusion, especially those words which one says, kneeling, et verbum caro factum est, et habitavit in nobis, with all the people also genuflecting at that point, because it reminds us that we are at that point tabernacles of the Most High. So, this was what was going on in Austria, and it is something that is a light with regard to exploitation of elements that we have abandoned, and which actually were present embryonically in the teaching of the Council Fathers, because there was a desire that the divine office should be rediscovered as the prayer of the Church, and not just by the clergy. I make a jump. In England, in their own way, the Anglicans had taken this on board, and that has remained the case to this present day, for matins and evensong have become important moments of encounter. They are well celebrated, a sermon takes place, and hymns are sung with an organ, and also other parts are sung, the scriptural parts, and a good idea of scripture comes through the exploitation of readings over the whole liturgical year. Now, I mention this for two reasons. One is that the scriptures had to be reopened, and this was part of the intuition of Pius Parsch. And therefore, the biblical revival is parallel to the liturgical movement. We now take it for granted that we understand and follow the readings and even prepare them with meditations in little books like the Magnificat. But it wasn't the case before the Second Vatican Council, and for many a Catholic, Scripture was not opened. It was almost regarded as a Protestant book, the Bible. So, the double intuition was a good one. But this one, with regard to the exploitation of the prayers, the hours of the liturgy outside the Mass itself, has not been sufficiently taken on board. In a monastery or in a hermitage, as here, of course it happens naturally. We have the sun, the Blessed Sacrament, but we have the rays emanating from it, the other hours of the liturgy. Well, things do dovetail in and out. For instance, shortly now it will be time for Lauds at 6, and then it will dovetail into the celebration of Holy Mass, and the people will start to assemble. But then it goes on. Now, this element of only having the Mass is not really adequate. It is the essence, but there are elements of imbalance there. If we have a situation where massively in the Catholic world the only thing that happens in church is the Mass itself, there is something missing and there's something imbalanced. We need to pad it out, to complement it, and this has to be looked at. It has not been sufficiently examined since the Vatican Council, because that would have been the desire of the Council Fathers. And by the way, I open another parenthesis here. The whole question of people unable to do anything else but have a communion service in the absence of a priest has to be looked at. There is something to be said for having a thirst and a hunger for the Blessed Sacrament, and having the capacity to pray with dignity the liturgy of the hours sung. Unfortunately, in Ireland, the only thing that lay people seem to succeed in doing outside Mass is saying the Rosary. It's not enough. We need to rediscover the liturgy, and not the Rosary mode of saying the liturgy at high speed, but I mean the celebration of it. That can be done by lay people. It has been taken on board by some centres of renewal. The charismatic renewal often does make great use of singing, but it's not difficult. The notion of saying is one, the notion of celebrating is another, and the liturgy is meant to be celebrated. It is the prayer of the Church. Therefore we give it maximum, not minimum, attention. And by the way, I did notice already in the mid-70s that in St. Peter's in Rome, that had been taken on board on a Sunday. There was the solemn celebration of Vespers in the chapel of the cathedra, that's the one at the far end of St. Peter's, the apse end. Vespers sung with incense on a Sunday evening around 5. And it wasn't benediction actually there, it was emphasized obviously that the point was being made indirectly that Vespers in itself was a main point of the Sunday. And to have it there at St. Peter's already in the years after the council, celebrated well with a sermon, I think, was interesting. It can be done. I remember in 1971 in France seeing how Vespers was still celebrated well, sung, and by the people and priests in Rouen in one church. At Notre Dame as well in Paris, Vespers was sung by clergy and people and nuns well on a Sunday evening. In French that was. In Ireland, we are unwilling to in any way innovate in the positive sense. We're afraid. We miss the blessings and graces that the Lord meant for us. Sometimes, says Parsch, our conclusions have prompted me to make certain proposals regarding the possible future development of the liturgy of the Mass. I am impelled not by profitless disaffection, but by an ardent love of Holy Church. I long to see this jewel in her crown, the Eucharist, shine forth in as perfect a setting as is possible. So the setting of the Mass is vast, and we forget the richness that we have inherited. It's not just the Eucharist itself, it's the fullness of the praise of the Church, of which it is the culmination. And you know that in the East, they have never lost that. They have one celebration of the Divine Liturgy, but it is not just the Mass on its own in isolation. Before celebrating, the priest must have celebrated Vespers, which are celebrated with incense and fully sung on the Saturday evening. The hours of night prayer are somehow included in the prayer that goes on before he actually gets to the centre of the Divine Liturgy, because he starts very early in the morning. He starts actually behind the holy doors with preparation of the gifts, all calculated and solemn. And so there is a whole movement. And then, of course, they also have Vespers on a Sunday afternoon. And by the way, in our own Eastern churches, those under Rome, canon law for the Eastern churches, those under Rome, does allow for the satisfying of the Sunday obligation by the assistance at either First Vespers or the fullness of the Divine Liturgy on Sunday morning, or evening prayer, Vespers, which also has incense, on the Sunday evening, because they only have the one celebration at midday. That's how they get around it in the Eastern Church, that is those under Rome. It's in canon law. It shows the goodness of our Holy Mother the Church, trying her best in a modern situation to help rather than hinder people to receive grace, and not to create sins. Now, therefore, that shows how there it is appreciated, how these are veritable celebrations of the liturgy. It's not just a whizzing off of said prayers. It is celebration, and it's very uplifting. The proposals that Pius Parsch makes radical enough in his day, are moderate, and are well argued from liturgical history. Vernacular readings, the restoration of the offertory procession, an increase in the number of prefaces, frequent communion from hosts consecrated at the same Mass, an improvement in the quality of the bread used at Mass, and the reception of Holy Communion under both species. Significantly, he does not envisage the vernacularization of the Mass, and far from calling for any reform of the Roman canon, he underlines the value of its silent recitation in a most beautiful passage. He does call for the reform of the number of collects. Now remember, that could be quite heavy before the simplification under Blessed John the 23rd. Parsch knew well that liturgy had developed. Now, he is aware of history, and we need to be in that same mode before we attack the liturgy. So, he's aware that the liturgy had developed over time and believed that it ought to continue to do so. His desire for reform respected the principle of the organic development of liturgy. So we have this quotation here from his own pen. Our Eucharistic rite may be compared to an ancient and magnificent cathedral. It is a structure of prayers and ceremonies that has been 1900 years in building. Clearly, therefore, every age and style will have made its contribution, and it would be a grave mistake to ignore the later elements in its construction, and to seek to reduce the Mass to its ancient classic style. We must accept the Mass as it has developed through the ages. We may indeed prefer the ancient style. Such an attitude is understandable. But to condemn outright everything that is of later origin would be petty and unworthy. Now, here we have a great light, and we notice two things. He is concerned to exploit what is there, but he is deeply respectful for what he is receiving. I would suggest that part of our problem is that we don't exploit what is there, and that this is the main source of abuse. We think we own the liturgy. Well, actually we don't. We transmit it to posterity, and we serve the Lord in this. We transmit it to posterity, and we treat it as an ancilla Domini, a handmaid of the Lord. It is sacred, and to think that we can manipulate it is to play the game of, yes, old Nick, pride, non serviam, I will not serve. To use the liturgy to glorify man is a very serious sin, and it's happening. Let us ask for the grace to be aware of who it is that we are facing and serving every time we take into our hands the ministry of praise. Vous avez été accepté à l'unanimité. Lines written after being accepted for perpetual vows at the Abbey of St. Antimo in 1996. O joy on earth, O joy yet in the world, to know that I am thine, and thine shall be, and thine alone, and by a little word upon this altar placed, eternally to this thy temple joined, to know that now no man or angel fiend can mar the road trod here by friends now crowned, that once did bow here where I place my head, to see the cloud of witnesses unseen walk calmly by, and chuckle at an aeon, to see all melt in a moment felt, nay, and to cry a tear of blissful peace. This is to call from out of the abyss of failure vast, and clutch at but a notch of grace at last.